Okay, good morning everyone. Let me know if this is too loud or too quiet. So I am here also from Copenhagen, and I'll be talking about a little bit about food waste to begin with in Denmark, just a few random statistics and stuff, and then I will be... Which way do I go?
The right.
Thank you. It's not very intuitive. Initially, I'll be talking a little bit about a few statistics, and I'll be introducing a couple of organisations that I've been involved in, then expanding into other concepts that are popular in Denmark, and then finishing up with a few sort of alternative ways for individuals to get involved in sort of the food waste scene, you could say. So to begin with, just a couple of statistics. This is from the Danish Statistics Bureau. I'm not quite sure what you would call it. The organisation that creates statistics on behalf of the Danish state. And as you can see, this is true in almost at least every European country. The majority of food waste comes from people's homes, followed by the retail sector, which involves supermarkets and other sort of food businesses. The food industry, which is the manufacturing and creation of the food products. Farming producers, which is farmers. Institutions and industrial kitchens, which is, for example, hospitals, daycares, elderly care homes. And then the final smaller percentage is restaurants, which tends to get a lot of attention, and I'll talk a little bit about them later, but they don't actually represent a big picture. So the reasons for food waste are numerous. These are some of the biggest ones that I could come up with and backed up by research. Cosmetic standards are also similar to safety concerns in some ways, but people basically have this perception if things look bad, they're not good for you. This is also enforced by the European Union rules on cosmetic standards, which I'm sure many of you have heard of because it's caused a lot of controversy in recent years. The bulk selling and the over-purchasing. Supermarkets encourage you to buy lots of a product, or they give you a discount. Also, this is particularly interesting in Denmark, is that one particular supermarket chain stopped selling stuff in larger bags because they realised that people kept buying too many of them and simply throwing it all away. Transport and storage issues. This comes down simply to the companies moving things around. If you produce your peaches in southern Spain and have to get them to Denmark, that's not an easy process. People's expectations. People also have, as a result of basically experiencing these cosmetic standards for many years, have very high expectations of how food should be and how it should look and stuff, and therefore they won't accept other things. Safety concerns. This is a little bit about the dates over here too, which I won't touch too much on because my partner Irina will talk about them later. Yeah, but also the misunderstanding of the date labels. There's a lot of misconceptions, which I won't go into today, but you're welcome to talk to me afterwards if you have questions. And then for stock management, this is mostly supermarkets and retailers, but you could also say people aren't managing their own stock in their fridges very well. But simply not having a clear idea of what your customers want to buy or how quickly you'll sell a product and things like that. This is a big Danish organisation which I just felt was good to introduce at the beginning because I think I'll bring them up at least 2 more times during this project. It was started by a Russian woman called Selina Yul, who arrived in Denmark I think 20-something years ago, and was then horrified at the amount of food waste coming from a poor suburb, I believe, of Moscow. She'd never sort of experienced this, and then came to Denmark just to see the pure mountains of stuff which was being thrown away. This inspired her to start Stop Spillemel, which means stop wasting of food in English, and she has basically pushed the Danish government, Danish industries, and also the EU to really improve things. And that has led to, you could say, a lot of smaller initiatives and ideas and projects in Denmark, some of which I will mention later. So the next part I'm going to talk about are the 2 initiatives that I'm personally involved in, and then I'll touch on a couple of other small initiatives that exist, but I'm not directly associated with. The first is our community fridge in Copenhagen. We're the first and currently the only community fridge in Copenhagen, but we hope that we're to inspire others and to create further sort of projects like this. So what it is simply put, is we took 2 fridges and stuck them in a park in the middle of Copenhagen, in, strictly speaking, almost like the geographic centre of the city if you draw a circle. It's a very simple concept, and as you can see, they're literally just sitting there inside the park. The idea is to basically promote unconditional sharing, so that anyone can come at any time and drop off or take food. We have a variety of donors which supply us with food, and otherwise members of the public are also welcome to simply stop by and leave surplus from their homes. We get at least 1 or 2 messages a month, people asking us, can you like come to my place and get all this food if I'm leaving the country or something. Not quite what we want to do, but it's like, it's clear that we've spread a lot of the message. We've also been interviewed by one of the Danish TV channels for this, so there's been a lot of attention since we started. Our organisation is 100% volunteer-based, which is, you could say, a challenge we faced is that the authorities in general, the state, the municipality, are not super keen on funding us because of the questionable sort of situation that we sit in legally. The project is legal per se, but because it's a little bit grey, they don't support us. But the cost of running this is almost zero. I think we spent equivalent to maybe €100 starting it all up, and then maybe another 100 in the last 2 years that we've been running. And then we rely on volunteers to collect from our various donors to keep the fridges clean and safe, and to help with the maintenance of the structure and things like that. So we got the idea actually from a similar project in Aarhus when we were considering to start this project. It's an idea I'd had for 3 or 4 years, but never got around to actually doing it. We went to Aarhus, which is the second largest city in Denmark, and visited a project there which had been running since 2014, I think. They started off as a dumpster diving cafe where they basically collected food from the supermarkets, not so legitimately you could say, and then cooked it and gave the food away. They realised they had too much food and people didn't necessarily want to come all the time. For example, some of the people who took food from them didn't feel comfortable being seen or didn't want to interact with people. So they simply put some fridges outside, and people could then come any time of the day or night. These guys have since then grown hugely. They got 2 million kroner in funding, I think it was. I'm not quite sure what that is in euros, but it was a lot of money. They also got given some land to build basically a proper industrial kitchen and to sort of, like upscale their project. Now they're very big in Aarhus. We are also, you could say we inspired a similar project in Copenhagen, which is a small city in the southwest of Denmark. They're the ones up here in the corner. They basically copied our concept, working with the local municipality more directly in this case, and a newly created culture house. And they, also in their case, they got some funding to sort of build a very nice looking structure, and also the requirements of the people they were working with was that they had to be, had to have it all sort of above board. We're not new at all. This idea, I actually came up with it, you could say, independently, but then I realised later that it's actually very common. I don't quite know where the first community fridge started, though I get the feeling the idea is like 20 years old or something. And then in recent years, it's experienced an explosion in growth, especially in the United States due to the pandemic. It put a lot of pressure on a lot of people because of unemployment and other sort of social issues being exacerbated by the sort of collapse of certain social institutions and stuff. So this led to a huge growth of these projects. I know they exist like from Hong Kong, Australia, through much of Europe, through North America, especially the US and Canada, and I think there's even some in South America. Like the idea can basically be copied and pasted anywhere, and the costs are not usually particularly high. It's also not particularly high maintenance. So the next project I'm going to talk about is Food Sharing in Copenhagen. This is a slightly similar concept. It's an organisation I've been involved in since 2017. And it began 2015, I think, the original idea, and has then grown a lot since then. Unfortunately, part of this is in past tense because a lot of the activities I will show ceased during the pandemic, and then the organisation's never completely recovered as a result. But the idea and the concept is definitely not new, and there are others that have sort of taken the idea and grown it since. So what Food Sharing in Copenhagen did, does on a smaller scale now, is basically collected food from various retailers around the city, a lot of it from the main wholesaler market on the outskirts of the city, and then we brought it all to a culture house or various culture houses in the city, and then gave it away to people. Similar to our community fridge, which we talked about a moment ago, the idea is that it's completely unconditional sharing, which is, I think, something that a lot of people struggle with. Because most people assume that this food is intended for poor people, but the idea of Food Sharing in Copenhagen, the people who started it, was that it was completely unconditional, so anyone could take it. I spent a lot of time explaining to people who came by, it's like, what are you guys doing? This is really cool. And I'm like, you're welcome to have some food. And they're like, no, I can't, you know, I'm not poor. And I'm like, this is not the idea. We have never had any intention of giving it specifically to poor people, which I think blew a lot of people's minds. But it's also a very controversial idea that, you know, this surplus food should only be given to those who are poor. It's like, well, why do poor people deserve poor quality food necessarily? Like, the food should be given to anyone, and that was the idea, the founding sort of values of food sharing. Copenhagen. This photo, I just think, really illustrates the growth of the organisation in the course of 1 year. We went from around 30 or 40 people coming, and the equivalent of 2 cargo bikes, which, if you're not familiar with, is basically a regular bicycle with a large container on the front of it. So they were using those to pack the food from the wholesaler market at the time. They grew from that to, at our peak, which was around 2018, 2019, there was around 200 to 300 people coming. We collected around 2.1 or 2.2 tons of food 2 times a week. And yeah, that was like a huge operation to maintain it. That's part of why the pandemic really hit the organisation hard, because we relied on so many people to keep it running. So this is an example of the wholesaler market, which in recent years moved to the outskirts of the city. This is where there's a lot of shops selling in bulk. So they would come and they would be like, you can take, you know, that entire mountain of, you know, carrots, for example, in this photo. And then we had the trouble of how do we get rid of all these carrots. This is an example of the van when we arrived at the locations. We then So we spent 3 to 5 hours in the morning collecting the food from the various donors. We then brought it all to, in this case, it's Alan Hirst in Nova, which is one of the inner city suburbs. Then we had around 2 hours where the volunteers sorted the food, getting rid of anything that was bad and sort of making it more presentable and easy. And then we began a distribution, which this gives you an idea. This is one of our shift leaders giving us an introductory speech, because we just kind of had to keep reiterating how it worked, and so people get the idea. Everyone could come in, basically. Originally it was just first come, first served. Later we introduced a sort of ticket system, so you booked a time, or you came at a certain time, depending on what number you got. And then people would simply come in. The food is all laid out in front of you. Picture here. And then they could simply take whatever they wanted. If we had a lot, they could take as much as they wanted. If we had a little, people got smaller amounts. But it was very much, up to the individual what they were interested in. We didn't sort of force anything on people. And then, there was no question of who are you, why are you here, And we literally asked no questions as long as you had a ticket when we introduced that. Before that, it was purely if you showed up. And there's another example. We also, something that I personally worked with a lot was running special events on public holidays, Easter and Christmas, because in Denmark, both of them I think, most of the shops are closed for sort of 2 to 3 days each year, and this results in huge amounts of extra waste. So we always then organise special events on these holidays, which was always a lot of fun, and I think it really sort of brought about the Christmas spirit, gave a lot of people an opportunity to perhaps get some food if they couldn't afford it and stuff. As I mentioned, though, unfortunately, a lot of this is in the past. The organisation was hit very hard by the pandemic. A lot of the core members have left or moved on with their lives as a result, and it was very difficult to continue operating during the pandemic. So now, these days, it's a very small-scale operation. It's running once a week, not every week. It's very varied. I'm not personally super involved anymore. I'm still technically part of the board, but it's just, I've moved on myself as well, you could say, focused on other projects and other interests. So this is one of the successes to the organisation, which basically you could say they could just copy and pasted the concept under a new brand. They have actually managed to rebrand, and they're currently growing quite a bit. They've taken, you could say, everything that was good about it and taken it to a sort of new location, new level. They've also been a bit more successful with getting a lot more donors. They have, in a sense, sort of unlimited number of supermarkets available to them. It's just depending on their own capacity. And the organisation I mentioned at the very beginning, the Stop Spill of Mel, inspired Stop Spill of Kale, which means stop waste locally. This was started by a young Danish guy who, I actually don't know him, I haven't heard his story, but he basically got the idea of creating large amounts of Facebook groups under this brand and encouraging people to start initiatives in their own towns. This resulted in, I don't think I included the number, but 120 cities. I think it's way more groups than that because it's every suburb within a city. Some of these groups are huge and super successful, others, there's nothing happening in them. Like in the local area that I live in, Copenhagen, there's currently nothing. But I know in some of the smaller cities in rural Denmark, they have like big operations going and they're running almost every day and stuff. Very similar concept to food sharing, but these guys often do require like you to prove in some way that you need the food, which is kind of a very different idea, but the basic concept is the same. There's also a lot of other similar projects in Copenhagen. These two here are very similar, but are very much focused on distributing it to people in need. But this website, Gratis Mel, which means free food, was created by Stopspil and Mel to try to basically bring together all of the different organizations in Denmark in one place where you can find them. Mostly, again, intended to help people who need the food, but it's also really cool that they sort of brought them all together. Our community group is registered on that website, so we're one of the 724 organizations that exist. This also gives you an idea of Denmark, a little bit like Lithuania, is not a particularly big country. There's 5.6 million people, most of which live in Copenhagen. So to have 724 plus groups registered around the country doing some sort of food sharing activity is quite spectacular. It's also something that's grown, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is community kitchens. This is something that I actually didn't, I've been involved in for a very long time, but I didn't actually know was quite as big and as popular as it is. The idea, basically, I've taken the Danish words here because I think it sums it up quite well. Folkekøkken means a people's kitchen. The idea is it's basically a restaurant or a sort of place where people can get together and cook food, a little bit like what we're going to do after lunch or for lunch here today. And fællesspisen means shared dinner. And while I was actually preparing for this, I was researching it, and it turns out there's actually a lot of these in Copenhagen. On my next slide, I listed a few. I've personally been involved with Cafe X for many years now, and that's kind of how I knew about the concept, but in researching it, it turns out there's a lot of these. And the concept has actually become very popular in recent years in Denmark. There's also some restaurants that have like not necessarily commercialized the concept, you could say, but like tried to divert a little bit from what they traditionally did in order to create these kinds of sort of common eating. So instead of everyone sitting around, 2 and 2 at a table, for example, they would, like this, create large tables, encourage people to actually sit together. Absalon is an interesting example. It's in a decommissioned church, which is now being converted into a community centre, and they run dinners every single day. I think you pay 50 kroner, which is around 5 or 6 euros, I think, and then you can basically eat whatever you want. Many of these, or basically all of these, are based on a sort of small donation, or are basically depending on what you can afford to pay. I'm zooming in on one in particular because it's quite relevant to the later part of my presentation. The One Bowl is a community restaurant, you could say, a pay-as-you-feel restaurant. So the idea is that anyone can come and anyone can eat, and then you give as much as you can. They used to encourage a donation of between 50 and 100 kroner, which is, I think, under 10 euros. But that was in order to pay their rent. But the idea was that you could basically also pay for someone else, for example, by giving a bit more. If you can't afford to pay, no one asks. There's no one standing there being like, can you give us something? It's just purely a donation box in the corner. You can give it if you want. If you don't have to. This Taste the Waste is a creation that me and my partner created, which was trying to basically combine food sharing in Copenhagen and One Bowl, because One Bowl had a kitchen and we had a lot of food. Often food sharing in Copenhagen had a lot of leftovers and people got a lot of vegetables they didn't know what to do with. I once, for example, spent like 3 hours trying to get rid of Jerusalem artichokes. I don't know if any of you know them. They're sort of fairly they're sort of an older sort of Danish food, which is not super popular these days. And it was very difficult to explain to people what they are and how you can cook them. And this sort of led me to think it would be really cool to try and create a concept where we take these like harder to use vegetables and these large quantities of vegetables and experiment with cooking them for people and try to encourage people to sort of think outside the box and think how can you use these. Because the problem often was at our food sharing events that we'd have large amounts of certain things, especially some rarer things that you don't find in the regular Danish supermarkets necessarily. And everyone would be like, I don't want that because I don't know how to use it. And then we'd have someone try to explain how to use it. I thought it would be cool to try to encourage people, like to show people how you could use it. So we created this event where, I went too far, apologies, where we then basically experimented with like creating things out of these food. This photo in particular is our famous bread balls, which was basically taking surplus bread, pulling it apart, and then mixing it with herbs, mushrooms, other spices, and then compacting it back into a ball and frying it. These were super popular, and people kept asking us for the recipe for them. We also, you could say the concept works very well during the pandemic, when both One Bowl and Food Show in Copenhagen had to close. In Denmark, we were allowed to continue to run takeaway events, and you were allowed to gather up to 10 people in one place. So we had just enough people to cook, and then we could do takeaway events. We were trying to basically raise money to help One Bowl pay its rent during the period. And our most successful event, which was kind of crazy in retrospect, where we ran for 2 days. We cooked lunch, and dinner over Saturday and Sunday, and fed, I don't know if I wrote down, 300 people, and raised around 6,000 Danish kroner, with a cost of around 300 kroner to actually do the entire thing, which was super spectacular. So, the final part of my presentation, I'm going to talk about other approaches, because you could say what I've talked about is accessible to some, but is not accessible to others. For example, food sharing, when we had events during the middle of the day, doesn't really help you if you have to work, and we couldn't necessarily leave the food anywhere. Our community fridge addressed that a little bit, but it doesn't completely. There's also the stigma / impression, basically, that this food is intended for poor people, therefore people with regular jobs and a good income wouldn't come and take it. So I thought it was good to sort of talk about some of the other initiatives out there, which you could say are trying to open up this sort of scene to other people, to give people access to these surplus foods. Too Good To Go, which I found out you don't have in Lithuania, is a Danish startup which is now growing super large across much of Europe, which basically created the idea of magic bags, which allowed people to, the supermarkets, restaurants, bakeries, anyone who has food basically puts it in a bag and then they advertise it on their website. You never know what you're going to get, but the idea is that you'll get stuff that the supermarket or other food business is going to throw out. We have WeFood, which is similar to potatoes, which basically is a shop selling stuff that has expired. Not past the expiry date, but past the best before date. They sell a lot of dried goods, a small amount of fruit and vegetables, and these days a lot of beers, bottled beverages and stuff, purely because their shops are often located in places where that makes a lot of sense and it's a good money maker, because they also have rent to pay and things like that, the costs to running it. We also have Eat Grim, which is a Danish startup which was focusing on trying to basically give people access to what they call ugly vegetables. Grim means ugly in Danish. And they basically run a subscription box that anyone can buy. I think it's 200-300 Danish kroner a week. And then they'll send you a box full of fruit and vegetables which would not make the cosmetic standards, along with instructions on how to cook them. And finally, Tusen, which is a large Danish supermarket chain, originally from Norway. They made it in here because they're one of the biggest in terms of working with food waste and experimenting with how to sell stuff that people don't necessarily want to buy. One of their shops donates regularly to our community fridge, and I know that their manager, for example, is part of a trial of selling sort of uglier fruits and vegetables which they can't normally sell. They have also, for example, created a bunch of different products made of surplus food. They have packs of pears, for example, which don't meet the cosmetic standards, but you can buy them there under the Stop Spill and Mel logo, which I mentioned earlier. There's also a lot of companies in Denmark working with repurposing surplus food. Roll, for example, was actually started by a Lithuanian who actually studied in Vilnius. I've known him for years, where they took surplus bread and surplus fruits, and then they create beer and kombucha out of it. There's many others. Banana, for example, is working with one of the biggest Danish supermarket chains, taking surplus bananas, things that don't perhaps make it, they're not good enough by the time they make it to the shop, so they wouldn't be able to be sold, and they're creating ice cream out of it. There's a bunch of different organisations working with reusing coffee grains. Danes drink a lot of coffee, they have a lot of coffee machines that produces large amounts of this sort of waste. And finally, a very alternative way of sort of fighting food waste is dumpster diving, which I've heard is not particularly well known in this country. It's kind of an unheard of concept. It's known as skipping in the UK, or skip diving, things like that. It's the idea of going to the back of the supermarket and taking food from the trash. The concept is, it varies a lot from country to country. In Denmark, it's perfectly legal, and as long as you don't basically break or enter in any way, you're not going to get prosecuted for it. The attitudes of supermarkets, I'll talk about in a minute, varies. But this has become, you could say, very, very popular in the mainstream, I think more recently, although I'm not sure, but it's like the average Dane does know about it. It makes some news. We actually one of our news channels wrote to us the other day and asked us, you know, would we be interested in showing them, because it's got a lot of attention with a lot of, you know, food prices rising and people struggling to buy things. And Danish supermarkets have a lot of waste. They've cut it a lot, I think something like 50 or 60% in the last 10 years. Denmark's gone from one of the worst in Europe to somewhere in the middle, but it's still a lot of food going to waste every day. The food authorities are not super keen on the practice. They actively discourage it, but I am personally, I'm alive. If you do it carefully and you know how to basically check for the safety of the food, then it's perfectly safe. It's also interesting to sort of understand the perspective of the shops, because that varies a lot from business to business. This photo is from an article I read a couple of weeks ago, and a manager of Spa, which is it's called the Equipment, but it's under the Spa brand, a Dutch company that have operated in Denmark for a long time. Their shops are semi-independent, so the managers are allowed to do what they want. So this guy basically took a container that they normally use for the returned bottles and cans to put all the food in, because if he throws it in the bin, people technically can take it, but it's kind of a legal grey area, and especially for him. So instead he puts it in this container and then just told everyone in his community they're welcome to come and take it. Helps him save money on waste, and helps other people in his local community to get food if they're in need and stuff like that. But we've also, through all the different projects I've talked about, had a lot of collaboration with shop managers. Some of them super against it, some of them super happy to allow people to come and stuff. The official position of most of the chains is kind of varied. I've heard one of the biggest Danish supermarket chains at one point was like, it's fine, people are welcome to, and then internally sent out an email to all their shops saying, you have to stop people. It again varies, because I know plenty of shops in that chain that don't care. So. And that's all. Does anyone have any questions? You're also welcome to talk to me, because I know I've covered a lot of different topics today, so I'll be around all day.